And then it's like I shifted, is the best way to describe it, is that I was no longer in a place that was filled with visual imagery and light. And instead, it's like I shifted into a state of immense consciousness. It was like my consciousness had expanded in its capacity from a Pentium 2 to a Pentium 1000 mega computer.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ascension Gateway. I am Sharon Sanani-Kumara, and I am thrilled and so excited to be speaking with my guest today, Dr. Yvonne Kason. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yep, that's just fine.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Doctor.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, you have so much to share. Woo, wow. I'm just blown away by your experiences. I just finished reading your latest book and ended up buying the one before that. So, wow, is all I can say. And I'm going to read your bio to give our audience a little taste of what you'll be sharing today, okay?
Okie dokes.
All right, let me pull it up here. Okay, Dr. Yvonne Kason MD, MED, CCFP, FCFP, wow, is a president and co-founder of Spiritual Awakenings International, a global nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness and about all types of spiritually transformative experiences. And the past president of IANDS, 2019 to 2020, Dr. Kason is the person who in 1994 first coined the phrase spiritually transformative experiences, or STEs, which has now become the standard term used in the field. She is also the group leader and co-founder of Toronto Awakenings Sharing Group. Dr. Kason has had 5 near-death experiences, NDEs, 2 in her childhood and 3 in her adult life, as well as multiple STEs. Easier for me to say that, of many kinds. Dr. Kason is a retired family physician and transpersonal MD psychotherapist, previously on faculty at the University of Toronto, and an internationally renowned medical expert on NDEs, Kundalini Awakening, and other STEs. In 1990, Dr. Kason was the first Canadian medical doctor to specialize her medical practice in the research and counseling of patients with diverse types of STEs. She has over 40 years' experience counseling STE experiences. She co-founded the Kundalini Research Network in 1990, was the chair of the Kundalini Research Network's questionnaire research project, results published in Explore, July 2020. She co-founded the Spirituality in Healthcare Network in 2000. Dr. Kason has 6 published books. Her most recent, Soul Lessons from the Light, How Spiritually Transformative Experiences Changed My Life, December 2022, and Touched by the Light, Exploring Spiritually Transformative Experiences, 2019. She has made hundreds of professional presentations, has given scores of media interviews, close to 100 podcasts, 101 now, is in demand as a keynote speaker. Dr. Yvonne Kason lives in Toronto, Canada, and enjoys snowbirding during the winter months in Encinitas, California. Websites are dryvonnekason.com, spiritualawakeningsinternational.org, and torontooawakenings.org. And I will have all that information in the details.
Awesome. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. You know, I want to say a couple of things first before you start sharing your experiences, your amazing, mind-blowing experiences. Some of what we could talk a little bit about here is, I wish I had known about you 20 years ago and your work, because that's when I was going through a Kundalini awakening after my NDE, after my head injury, and I didn't understand what was happening with me. So I ended up being in the medical system and placed in a psych ward for a week, which I kind of think everyone should spend a week in the psych ward because it was like a vacation where I was anyway. But people, no one understood what was going on with me, and I didn't understand it.
Right,
So I really
right.
wish that I would have known that. But hey, it happened the way it did. So
Mhm.
thank you so much for being a trailblazer to help people who are having experiences that they aren't understanding.
Well, thank you for your gratitude. I really appreciate it. It hasn't always been easy.
Oh, I'm sure. I know, because I read this. I mean, I shouldn't say I know, but I understand. I can relate a little tiny bit with what you shared in your book. Yeah.
Hmm.
So if you don't mind sharing a little about your near-death experiences and some of your STEs, what you feel compelled to share with my audience. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, first off, I want to say that thank you for your words about how important you feel it is that I'm groundbreaking to bring awareness of the whole range of spiritually transformative experiences. I mean, some types of experiences, there seems to have been more press in North America, for example, the near-death experience.
Mhm.
And then there became increasingly more press about end of life experiences and then after death communications. But there are other really common STEs that nobody was talking about, specifically Kundalini awakening, various types of mystical experiences, and most importantly, people were not talking about the after effects that having one of these experiences is not just like an isolated incident and then you're back to the same person you were the next day. It's an ongoing transformation process that it seems to be beginning a long-term transformation in people's consciousness. And how I got into all of this as a medical doctor, because some of your listeners might wonder, well, how did she as a medical doctor get into this area? Well, how I got into it was because of my own personal experiences. And that's what I write about in the book that you held up, Soul Lessons from the Light, which is my most recent book and the story of my own personal spiritual awakening journey. I now realize I had two near-death experiences as a child, but I didn't realize that when I was a kid, because as a kid, you have no barometer or measuring stick of what's normal, what's paranormal. It's just what to you. So it actually was only about 5 years ago that, I realized, gosh, these powerful experiences that I had in my early childhood were also near death experiences. But I'm not going to start there. I'm going to start with my adult experiences that influenced me as a young doctor and ended up making me become the first Canadian medical doctor to specialize in this area. And what happened was it started when I was in medical school. So when I was in my last year of medical school, I took this meditation course that they advertised was to help you relax and study better, do better on your exams. So I thought, okay, because I mean, we had lots of exams. So I took this meditation course and I discovered something very interesting, which I now realize is past life memory, but I didn't know that back then. But to me, learning to meditate was like introducing a duck to water. It was like just a complete fit. I really loved it. I loved meditating. I started meditating every day, about an hour in the morning, hour in the evening. And yes, it helped me with my exams. I did very well in my exams. But interestingly enough, about 3 months after I started meditating, I had a very, very powerful meditation experience, which I now know, but it took me almost 10 years to figure it out, was a Kundalini awakening. And while I was meditating, all of a sudden I heard this loud inner roaring noise, like the roar of a waterfall, and loud roaring noise. And at the same time as I heard that loud inner roaring noise, I felt this really powerful rush of energy move up my entire body and spine. And as it came to the top of my head, it was like I slipped out and expanded. So what I thought of as me was no longer the size of like my head or body, but suddenly I was expanded and I felt I was in a large auditorium. I'd filled this entire auditorium, but not only had I expanded in size, but it was like my consciousness had transformed into a beautiful force field of love. I was feeling this incredible love. I remember at the time, because, I was young, I was 23. What did I, let me see, when was this? Yeah, I was 23. And I thought this was happening to everybody when they meditated. And I remember thinking, gosh, no wonder people like to meditate. This is phenomenal. This is awesome. And so I stayed in this expansive state of a beautiful love, which I now know was a mystical experience, but I didn't know it then, until my meditation ended. And then my consciousness contracted and I came back to my normal awareness. And like I said, for many years, I had no idea what that was. I didn't have words to describe what that experience was. And when I went to my meditation leaders, asking them why I wasn't having this experience every time I meditated, a couple of weeks later, having this every time I meditate, I must be doing something wrong with my technique. That's what I thought, that, I was embarrassed that, here I was, this, brilliant medical student, but I was making mistakes in my technique. That's what I thought. And I remember the meditation leader looked at me and jaw dropped and said, "What? That happened to you?" And I said, "Well, yes," thinking everybody had had this experience. And the leader said, "Well, the only thing I've ever heard of that sounds like that would be a Kundalini awakening, but it couldn't possibly be a Kundalini awakening because you're much too young. You haven't meditated long enough. You're not under the guidance of a guru. So it can't be a Kundalini awakening. I don't know what it is." So, okay, I didn't know what it was. But many years later, and as I started researching all sorts of spiritual experiences, including Kundalini awakening. Plus, I had the opportunity to travel to India and meet Gopi Krishna, whose mission was to bring awareness to the West about Kundalini awakening. I slowly realized that what I had experienced was indeed a Kundalini awakening. And I've now seen that happening to many people around the world. And in some yogic traditions, they do say this can't happen unless you're under the guidance or tutelage of a guru. However, if you take past lives into consideration, perhaps the initial awakening in a past life was under the supervision, guidance, and blessings of a guru, but now we are incarnations afterwards and we're awakening spontaneously. At least that is my conclusion for myself, and I think for many other people who are currently having so-called spontaneous in this lifetime Kundalini awakening.
If I can interrupt you just for one
Sure.
second, Doctor. So what about B also? Sometimes we are, I know I was under the tutelage of a teacher in the spirit world at that time.
That can be too. Doesn't have to be someone who's incarnated on the physical plane at this time. And a guru-disciple relationship is actually eternal. So that even if your guru is on the other side, and even if you don't know who that person is because you don't have memories of those incarnations at this time, that blessing and grace of the guru is with you eternally, according to yoga and Buddhism. And that has come to be my understanding.
Beautiful. Makes total sense.
So anyway, that was the first adult experience that sort of rattled my cage of being just a normal Western medical doctor. I didn't know what it was, but I put it off to the side as I was focusing on my final exams and then doing my residency as a young doctor. But then I had another powerful STE, or spiritually transformative experience, when I was finishing my residency, when I was in a plane crash while I was doing a medevac with a medical evacuation with a critically ill patient. And I'll tell you the story of that. But in that, I had what I now realize, and again, it took me almost 10 years to figure it out. What I now realize was a near-death experience, a white light mystical type of near-death experience that completely changed my life. And what happened that day, I'll just give a highlight of the key points because we have limited time here. As you know, I've written a whole book where I talk about all of my experiences, but in this particular experience, that's the one. And also this one, I put the plane crash chapter 1 in this one.
Yes.
That I was a young medical doctor already, and I was assigned this day to do this medical evacuation of a critically ill Native Indian woman from a community called Sioux Lookout, which is in Northern Ontario, Canada. And we were to fly her by a small airplane, which was not a helicopter. It was a twin engine plane, propeller plane called the Piper Aztec, for anybody who's into airplanes. Very small little plane that we were flying from Sioux Lookout to the closest major hospital that had an intensive care unit to look after her, which would be in Winnipeg. And so it should have been about a 1-hour flight, but this was in March, which is still winter in northern Canada. And the plane, we flew into bad weather, basically into like a blizzard, a storm. We had really bad turbulence. And what happened was the first one propeller malfunctioned and stopped. Then the other propeller malfunctioned and stopped. And as I mentioned, this was a 2 propeller plane. So if they stopped, that meant you had no engines going. And so immediately the plane started plummeting towards the ground, being jostled with really, really bad air turbulence. You know, we were in a storm. And if you ever wonder what it's like being in a plane crash, you won't miss it. You know, the turbulence is really bad. You know what's going on. And immediately my first like reflex reaction was intense fear and panic, like just this intense panic. And it just jumped out of my heart. I wasn't even thinking it, planning to say this. It just jumped like a reflex out of my heart. The thought, oh God, I'm going to die. And the moment that jumped out of my heart, that panic thought, is actually when my near-death experience started. So this was before the plane crashed, while the plane was still going down, which I think can give comfort to other people who wonder about what happens in plane crashes. Anyway, as soon as that came out of my heart, all of a sudden, this force field of peace started descending on me. And it was literally like it pushed down all of my fear and panic. And instead, I was filled with this incredible peace, incredible calm, incredible sense of safety. And I heard a voice. I heard a loud, clear inner voice. And before this experience, I had never heard an inner voice in this incarnation. And the voice very clearly said, "Be still and know that I am God. I am with you now and always." And with those words, they penetrated my soul, and the peace was transcendental. But I was fully alert, fully conscious. The plane had not crashed yet. I turned in that incredible, blissful state of peace, and I started comforting the patient. She had regained consciousness. And I remember I said to her, "Don't worry, everything's going to be all right." Because I knew somehow in my soul that whether we lived or died, everything would be all right. Anyway, the pilot really, really heroically was steering the plane, trying to get it not to crash into the trees and the forest, where it's all forested in northern Ontario. And he was trying to steer us over the surface of a semi-frozen lake. He pulled up the landing gear, was trying to do a guided belly landing on the ice. And he did. I mean, he saved our lives by avoiding the trees. And we would have been fine as we skidded across the ice if the ice had been thick enough. But it was not. Mm-hmm. And so when the plane came to a stop, it very quickly broke through the ice, nosedived, and sank into very, very deep water. So I had to get out of the plane really, really quickly while the plane was sinking. And the nurse, the pilot, and I, we all tried to get the patient out. Unfortunately, we couldn't. She went down with the plane, and then glug, the plane was gone. And there we were in open water in the middle of a winter storm, big waves, strong winds. And the closest land was maybe 200 yards away. And there was open water with a really strong current separating where we were from the closest land. And it turns out that the place that we crashed is called Devil's Gap. I mean, that's really its name, Devil's Gap on Lake of the Woods by Kenora. And it's called that because of the strong current there. The ice never freezes over properly in the winter, and it's treacherous in the summer. So we would have to swim the Devil's Gap to get to the closest land. And the voice in my head again spoke and said, swim to shore. Now, I remember, I'm sad but true, but I remember I argued with that voice. This was new to me, having higher guidance, which I've now learned over the years through painful lessons. Listen to the higher guidance when you get it. But back then, I had not learned that lesson yet. So I remember mentally arguing with the voice, and I was saying, I'm going to swim to shore. It's too far. I took lifeguarding. They tell you don't swim to shore in a boating accident. It's too far. You'll drown on the way. The pilot was shouting, try to get on the ice, try to get on the ice. So instead of following the voice, which I now know was my higher guidance, I started swimming away from shore towards the ice, hoping that it would be thick enough to support my weight, but it was not. And the voice repeated, swim to shore. And finally, the third time it said, swim to shore. I surrendered to that wisdom and I started swimming to shore. Now, it was a very hard and a very difficult swim. And I went under a few times, and lake water would start coming in my throat. And with all my strength, I would be kicking and paddling and trying to get my throat above water again and try to gasp some air into my lungs again. And then stroke by stroke, inching my way towards shore. Partway to swimming to shore is when my experience, or near-death experience, I now know, deepened. And what happened was all of a sudden, I heard that loud roaring noise again, similar to when I had the Kundalini awakening, like the roar of a waterfalls. And all of a sudden, I felt my point of perception slip up out of my body. And there I was, maybe 25 or 30 feet above my body, looking down. Wasn't dead. I was still swimming to shore. So it's more complicated than that. It's actually like my consciousness was two places at the same time. And I compare this to like a split screen TV, which is the best analogy I have found. It was a part of my consciousness, a small part, like a little image on a split screen TV, was still in my physical body that was desperately, stroke by stroke, trying to swim to shore. But the main part of my consciousness, like the big image on the screen, had now lifted up out of my body. And then the main part of my consciousness lifted even higher. And I went into, it's hard to have a vocabulary, but I went into a realm, I went into a state. What I experienced, all of a sudden, I found myself in a place or state that was filled with incredible, unconditional love, just powerful, overwhelming, unconditional love. And that was also brightly lit, filled with a soft, glistening, bright white light, sort of like what experiences when you're going up in a plane and you're in the top of the clouds just before it breaks into the sunlight and it's all glistening white and sparkling around you. That was how I experienced it in what many people now call the white light realm, although I'd never heard of it back at that time. But for me, it was dark and stormy in the physical world, but now I was in this place that was glistening with this beautiful, soft, lovely white light that was radiating just profound, unconditional love. And just for an instant, I saw a face of light, and then it sort of receded into the cloud-like periphery. But when I was in this, let me just call it realm of light, for lack of a better word, my soul knew things or recognized things, just automatically knew things without anybody having to tell me or explain it to me. I somehow absolutely knew that what I was experiencing, this love that I was feeling, was the love of our higher power, or what I had been raised in my childhood to call God. And what I was actually experiencing God to be was not anything like I'd been taught. It was not an old man on a throne, with a long white beard judging you. Have you been good? Have you been bad? No, that was not what I was experiencing. What I was actually experiencing was that the higher power, or God, was like this infinitely intelligent force field of profound love that is interpenetrating and underlying all of everything, past, present, future. And and I felt I was home. I felt like this is where I belonged. I felt completely safe. And as I was in this state, realm, experiencing the love of the higher power, I also somehow knew, don't ask me how, I just knew that what I think of as me would live on, whether my body down there still struggling to swim to shore would live or die. And it didn't matter to me whether the body lived or died, because I knew I was going to be okay. Anyway, the physical body down there struggled and struggled. And when my physical body was maybe 20 feet from shore, the current was very, very strong, carrying me to the right. I really did not, my body did not have the physical strength to go any further. And it seemed at that moment that the split screen split. So the majority of my consciousness went back to the body and a little bit was up in the light for my moment of death. And so I'm there, and I remember thinking, it's bizarre what you think in these moments, but I remember very clearly that I thought, gee, that's interesting. You really do drown the third time you go down, because this was going to be the third time I went down. And I was just ready to surrender, because, a part of me was in the light and just knew that I would live on, even though the body, it seemed, was coming to an end here. And then at that moment, as I looked through my physical eyes, I could see that the current was carrying me very rapidly to the right. And protruding from the island, I had swum close to the shore of an island. There was a really tall pine tree that had fallen into the water and was protruding into the lake water. And actually, the current was carrying me towards it. And in my mystical state of consciousness, it actually looked to me like there was a etheric hand of light superimposed on that tree, sort of beckoning me, like, you can do it, just another stroke and you'll be here. And it's true, one more stroke and the current carried me to the tree, and my hand hit the tree and it was so frozen I felt absolutely nothing. And I remember looking at it and I don't feel it. Anyway, I pulled myself along the tree, went to shore, and then I called out to the nurse and the pilot to come to shore. Well, to make a long story short, people want the details, have them in my books, but a whole series of miracles or coincidences, however you want to phrase it, I would call them divinely orchestrated coincidences, led to the fact that I was in fact rescued by a helicopter that normally would not have been there, who picked up a message that by miracle was picked up by a plane directly overhead, and all sorts of coincidences. But the pilots did find us. They managed to bring me to the closest hospital by helicopter. They landed on the hospital driveway. I was wheeled into the emergency department. And then, I feel like sharing this story, that while I was floating above my body, I watched the nurses try to take my body temperature, and they were just using a standard mercury thermometer. And I remember watching, and one of the nurses was like, is there something wrong with thermometer? No, there was nothing wrong with the thermometer. I was hypothermic, which means I was almost frozen to death, and my body temperature was lower than the reading she could get on her thermometer. And then all of a sudden, I heard a voice say, boy, could I use a hot bath? And I was amazed to discover that came out of my physical body, because I mean, I wasn't thinking of saying that, but that's what came out of my body. Boy, could I use a hot bath. I don't know if one of my guardian angels spoke through my body or what happened, but the nurses then looked at each other and said, hey, maybe that would help her. Let's bring her down to the physiotherapy and warm her up in the hot whirlpool baths, which is what they did. And it was there when they put my body in the hot water and they reheated me, is when my near-death experience came to an end, when my consciousness re-entered my body. And what I experienced was sort of like how they depict the genie being sucked into a bottle. It was like, oh, I had been in this big, expansive space above my body, and abruptly I was sucked in through the top of my head into the smaller confines of my body, and then I was back.
Mm.
I remember sitting there in the whirlpool bath, rubbing my hands, because I couldn't feel anything, because they were so frozen against my legs in the hot water, and I kept on saying, I'm back, I'm back, I'm
Yeah.
gonna live, I'm gonna live. And that was my first adult near-death experience, I now realize. But
Wow.
it took me years to figure out what it was.
Wow. Yeah. When I had my NDE in 2001, I didn't understand it. I mean, I didn't remember all of it at
Yeah.
first. Yeah, but I didn't know that it was an NDE. It didn't make any sense to me, everything that was coming to me. But wow, that's amazing that well, I I have no words. I can't even imagine. Of course, why would I? But I can't even imagine surviving from a plane crash and being frozen to death, basically, and surviving that. But what an amazing experience. When I will mention that when I was reading your book, I can't count how many times I was brought to tears. Just feeling I mean, a good thing, the feeling the love, my heart was just full of, as you express your experiences and are able to put them down on paper. Thank you. How I was filled with so much love. And yeah.
Yeah, well, the after effects from this near-death, what I now know was a near-death experience. I mean, love was really one of them. I mean, I'm really grateful that because of, the frostbite and recovering from the lake water in my lungs, etc., I had some time off work after the plane crash before I had to return to work as a doctor. And during that time, it was like, I call it, I was love intoxicated. It was like I brought some of that love from the other side back with me. And I was just, ooh, I remember I would be sitting there in my living room and I'd look out the window and I'd see the squirrels playing on the lawn, and I'd have these waves of love coming out of my heart for the squirrels, or I'd see the children riding their bicycles down the street and I'd be waves, bicycles. And same with music. I'd listen to music and everything would, put me in ecstasy, into tears. I was just literally, it was like some of it came back with me, and I was just overflowing with love when I first came back. But other things happened when I first came back too, is that I had a new clarity about what's important in life. I mean, before my that experience, that happened when I was 26. I'd been feuding with my dad, like a lot of young people do. We'd had our issues, and our last conversation, we'd not parted on good terms. And after this experience, after this near-death experience, I changed. I phoned up my dad. I said, Dad, I love you. Let's be friends. And we reconciled. We had an incredibly beautiful father-daughter relationship for the next 7 years until he unfortunately passed away. And I consider that one of the blessings from the near-death experience. Father hadn't changed. He still had the same quirks and things that used to drive me crazy. But after the near-death experience, it was me that had changed. Those things were all trivial now. And what was important was the love that we had between us.
Yeah.
So that was a profound gift for me. The other major gift or change that happened, I mean, yes, I lost my fear of death. Yes, I also became much more understanding, compassionate, and tolerant of people with diverse religious and spiritual views, because I just knew, I just understood from the perspective of where I'd been, that it's like all people trying to climb a mountain from different angles. They might be starting at a different starting point, but once you get to the top, you discover, hey, it's the same one peak we've been all striving for. We were just coming with a different understanding from a different perspective, whatever. But the big thing was that the transformation after this experience continued. And a few weeks after the near-death experience, what I now know is a near-death experience, I had my psychic awakening when I first started having psychic experiences. And what happened was I was driving to visit a friend one day. I was just stopped at a red light in my car. And all of a sudden, in my mind's eye, I got this clear visual image of my friend's brain covered in pus. And to me, as a medical doctor, how I knew it was my friend's brain, I have no idea, but I did. And the symbology was totally clear. To me, it was meningitis. And wouldn't you know it, when I arrived at my friend's house, I was a little sheepish to share this with her, but she ended up later on that day being admitted through the emergency department with acute meningitis. Fortunately, got enough treatment promptly and recovered. But this was the beginning. I then started having more clairvoyant experiences. I then started realizing that I was very clairsentient, that I developed this new sensitivity where I could sense other people's feelings and emotions. I could also sense very clearly if people were lying to me. I called it a truthometer that I developed it, and it was just in my consciousness. And clairaudience, hearing inner guidance, this became an ongoing part of my my life. All the clairs, I called them. I developed all the clairs, and then a few years later, I also started developing the ability to perceive past lives. So the transformation process after this experience continued. And this is what propelled me as a young medical doctor to start researching all kinds of spiritual and paranormal experiences, because I was having them. Not one kind, not two kind, all kinds of stuff. Kundalini awakening, near-death experiences, mystical experience, psychic experiences, and inspired creativity too. So for many years, I led a double life. So I was outwardly, I was, a Western trained medical doctor. I had a teaching position at the University of Toronto. I had a very successful career, but in the closet, I was a secret mystic and spiritual seeker. And I was meditating regularly, reading, books from various sacred traditions and psychology, transpersonal psychology, everywhere, trying to understand what I was actually experiencing. And something interesting happened over all those years too, is that it's like people found me as a doctor. Like somehow the universe brought more and more people to me as patients. They heard there's this doctor in Toronto you can talk to who won't immediately say you're crazy if you've had a spiritual or paranormal experience. So I developed more and more clinical experience in terms of counseling people. And I've heard so many people's stories. And finally, it got to the point in 1990, as you mentioned in your bio, I had a very strong STE, what I call my calling mystical experience, where spirit made it really clear to me that these two parts of my life had to come together. It was time for me to come out of the closet and to publicly be an advocate for STE experiencers, because the medical profession was doing harm by labeling anyone with a spiritual experience as crazy and treating it as a psychiatric illness. And churches were doing harm by calling it work of the devil. And, the general public was doing harm by calling it both of the above, or your imagination, or shut up and stop talking about it, all these sorts of things. So I had this very, very strong calling from spirit to specialize my medical practice. And through the grace of God, I went through all the hoops I had to within the medical profession, within the university, to not get kicked out, to not lose my license. And then I from that point on, specialized in counseling people with diverse types of spiritually transformative experiences. Now, Spirit didn't want me to forget what my specialty was. So all of these years, my own spiritual process has been deepening, has been continuing. I'm having all sorts of STEs, many of which I describe in my books. And then two more very powerful near-death experiences, one in 1995 and my most recent in 2003, when I was actually clinically dead, like flatlined for a period of time. And I'd love to tell you that story if you'd like to hear it.
Of course, please share away.
Okay. My most recent near-death experience, which was on November the 8th, 2003, for me is different from my other earlier near-death experiences because this was the only one where I was actually clinically dead for a period of time. And so there were things that were revealed to me in this near-death experience that were not yet revealed in my earlier ones. I feel like each of my near-death experiences was cumulative, that as I was learning more about spirit and was having deeper experiences. For me, that's how it was with my near-death experiences. For other people, it's not necessarily that way, but that's how it was for me. So by far, my most profound was my most recent one. So November the 8th, 2003, what happened was I was meditating at the foot of the falls at Niagara Falls, Canada. I love meditating there because I find the roar of the waterfalls reminds me of the inner roar of the Om vibration that you can hear sometimes in meditation. And I find I can go very deep, very quickly when I meditate there. It's a PowerPoint on the planet for those of you looking for PowerPoints. I love PowerPoints. Anyway, that particular evening, I was meditating at the foot of the falls, and I had a profoundly deep meditation. And I actually went into a state of communion, a state of oneness, state of non-duality, whatever, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. The veils were parted, and I could see the other side, perceive, live in, felt, existing in the other side and this side at the same time. This is with my eyes open. And I saw a being of light appear to me on the other side, a saint from my spiritual tradition. It was Mahavatar Babaji, and he mentally or telepathically communicated to me, "Welcome home." And I felt just such great joy, bliss, peace beyond description. Anyway, I remained in that state of communion until I slipped on black ice, fell, hit my head on rock, had a serious traumatic brain injury, and died about 2 hours later. And I start with that because there's been much written now about end-of-life experiences, how people have experiences shortly before they die where the veil thins and they perceive the other side. Some people have even written that we're all enlightened shortly before we die. Well, I think this might have been my end-of-life experience, but I don't know. That's just what happened to me. So I was in that state of communion when I slipped on ice, hit my head on the rock pavement, had a serious brain hemorrhage, and died. And what happened was instantly I felt myself being whisked out of my physical body and rushed upwards through a dark expanse of space. Some might call it a tunnel. For me, it was a dark expanse of space. And then suddenly the world was gone, and I found myself approaching this radiant entranceway into the realm of light. And there at the entranceway were two beings of light welcoming me, who I instantly recognized, two saints from my tradition, Paramahansa Yogananda and Mahavatar Babaji. And they telepathically welcomed me with love and joy, and explained to me that my physical body had died, that my work in the incarnation of Dr. Yvonne Kason was done. And as I entered the realm of light, I felt such incredible joy, incredible love. it was like a celebration was happening in my honor. There's a guest of honor, and I'd arrived at my graduation party. And it was just a feeling of such love and welcome and joy. And I remember, I guess a piece of my ego was with me, and it was like a little devil on my shoulder. This little thought comes up. Uh-oh, here comes the life review. That was the thought that came up. Because by this time, I'd spoken with so many people who'd had near-death experiences, and those of them who'd actually been clinically dead talked about having a life review. And, I've tried to live a good life, but he's perfect. So I was not looking, this ego part of me was on my shoulder. The devil on my shoulder was worried about, uh-oh, what's going to come up in the life review? And it was so beautiful what happened, because the two saints, they read my mind, like they knew my thoughts. And one of them just very relaxedly looked over at me, gave me a glance. And with the glance, there was this incredible spiritual transmission that blew the old devil on my shoulder away and blew any concern away. And with that came the understanding, the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful understanding that the divine mother, father, God, however we come to understand that loving force underlying the universe, that loves us so completely and has such complete compassion, such complete understanding, that like an ideal loving parent who's watching their child learning how to walk, you realize, okay, the kid's going to fall, it's going to skin its knees, it might bump its head, it might break something when it falls. But the loving parent doesn't punish the child for these things. The loving parent embraces the child with love and says, that's okay, comforts the child. Try again. You can do better next time. And that was the sort of love and understanding that I was being welcomed with on the other side. And so my heart just opened wide open, any of that ego nonsense was just gone. And I just basked in that profound love and understanding. And then it's like I shifted, is the best way to describe it, is that I was no longer in a place that was filled with visual imagery and light. And instead, it's like I shifted into a state of immense consciousness. It was like my consciousness had expanded in its capacity from a Pentium 2 to a Pentium 1000 mega computer, that suddenly my consciousness was capable of taking in vast amounts of information all at once, just an instantaneous downloads. And I suddenly remembered all my past lives in a big sort of aha moment. It's like, yes, forgotten. That was sort of the feeling. Like, how could I have forgotten? And it made such complete sense. I mean, all of it made complete sense. An analogy I can compare it with is like a mosaic. So when we're here on Earth, we're like looking at one piece of the mosaic. And then if we get a past life memory, we get another piece of the mosaic. And then another past life memory, another piece of the mosaic. They may or may not sort of fit together. All of a sudden, all the pieces of the mosaic were put together, and they all made this incredible, beautiful picture that fit together perfectly when you could look at the bigger picture. And so finally, it was like I finally remembered / knew who I was. It's like, yeah,
Wow.
that's me. It's me. It's me. Yeah, that's me. It's a really healing feeling. Just, yeah, that is me. The good, the bad, the ugly, the in between is all part of the mosaic. That is all me and my soul's journey over many incarnations. And I realized and understood many things as I remembered my past incarnations. For example, I'd always thought it a bit odd that here I was, this little doctor practicing in Toronto, Canada, all of these experiences. I'm writing the book on spiritually transformative experiences. I'm having death experiences, researching Kundalini. And I'm just this little person, this little doctor in Toronto. And from the perspective of all of my past lives, it suddenly made sense. And I could just relax into it. It was like, of course.
So, Doctor, if I can interrupt you just for a second, do you feel that do you understand the reason why we don't, or did you get that? What I'm trying to say is, why do we not remember our lifetimes normally? Okay. I mean, because I
Well, I
was
think
shown mine too.
AIDS is a not divine gift, because we would tend to remember the bad things or the painful things. So that's the gift. But I think the other thing is that our consciousness in its capacity as we're incarnated in humans, we don't have the capacity to hold that amount of information. Yeah. It's like, trying to put mega computer information into a tiny little computer. It just won't fit. It makes the system crash. And so my experience being in the physical body is that these things are revealed to us on a need-to-know basis. And as spirit knows that we have the capacity to integrate, etc. But what I wanted to mention about with understanding my past lives and remembering them all was what I saw and understood and knew as a truth was that it's from an ego perspective, from a single lifetime perspective, you could think that's a bit odd that Yvonne Kason in Toronto is doing all this. But from a multi-lifetime perspective, from a soul, it wasn't odd at all. Because guess what? This is not my first incarnation doing these sorts of things. I've had Kundalini awakening in past lives. I've had mystical experiences in past lives, death experiences in past lives. I've written books about it in past lives. It's on a soul level, my soul was just carrying on from the pattern from past incarnations. But because I was not aware of that on an ego level before this experience, it was always like, oh, well, I'm like a star-shaped fish when everyone else is a different shape.